Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at HowlingMines. And by early, boy do I mean early, I am currently just a few hours away from boarding my flight to San Jose for the Flesh and Blood World Championships. And my intention was to record these deck techs before I went, to make sure that I could upload them, hopefully during the event, so they go live as and when the rounds that they are relevant to are finishing. That's hopefully the plan anyway. But I wanted to make sure that some World Championship deck lists were available to you folks that are looking to, learn from that event or pick up some deck lists, try some things for yourself that people, landed on heading out of their Worlds playtesting. So I've done this video, which you'll be seeing now for my CC deck, which is, of course, Iyslander Stormbind, a deck that I've played an awful lot of at the moment. And, of course, my Blitz deck as well, which was Briar, which will be going live for you shortly after the Blitz rounds take place on the end of the second day of the competition. So my plan here, very much to break you down how I ended up here, what my core looks like, what my sideboard plans are into every matchup, so that you can get a grip on what I think is currently the best version of Iyslander in Classic Constructed. So fingers crossed this is of some use to you, and I will happily let you know in hindsight how my World Championship went. I'm sure I'll be doing a full tournament report. I actually plan to do a bit of a vlog while I'm there, but it will be like mobile phone footage, so we'll see how that turns out. But you'll get an update, especially if you follow me on Twitter. Over at HowlingMines, about how the event is going, how I did in general, if that's the kind of information you want about this deck list. But here we go. Iyslander Stormbind. Now, unsurprisingly for people that have been following me for a while, I've been playing Iyslander since I had that incredible result with it in Lille, going 10-3 in the calling to finish 13th in a format where Prism was legal. And I've been playing it ever since, and I think it's a very good chance I'll be playing it after Worlds 2. The deck is still a blast to me as it continues to evolve and as the format evolves around it, even though it is now a more known quantity and people have much more experience playing into you than before. So unfortunately for those folks that was hoping I cracked an arcane-only list, like the list I played in Lille and at UK Nationals, I'm afraid I have some bad news. I did not. I am on a version of Michael Hamilton's Boltyn list. And the reason for that is very simple. Unfortunately, I think his mythos makes a lot of sense in the fact that your red arcane spells were only pushing 5 damage. In a world where Fi is coming for your scalp ever more quickly than before, the disruption is worse than ever because they have so many copies of Belittle in their deck. And Oldhim also getting more and more aggressive, caring more and more about on-hit triggers. You don't have time to set up your full combos in those matchups either, so you need your red spells to be impactful, and 5 damage is not impactful enough, even when occasionally played alongside Insidious Chills and similar effects. So we have made that concession. You'll see my list is very similar in a lot of ways to the one that Michael played at US Nationals, but I have been testing extensively during this period. That is not exactly the same. There are some changes that are mine, and are mine alone, I hope, fingers crossed, heading into Worlds, which I look forward to explaining as we go forward. So, we're going to start this off going card by card in the core of the deck. These are the cards you'll basically see in every matchup. There are a few small exceptions. There is for example, Amulet of Ice, Heart of Fiendel. There's like 1 or 2 matchups they come out to either make space or because they're a bit of a liability. I'm sure we'll go into that during the sideboarding, which you can find timestamped on this video. But for the most part, they start in every other matchup, so they are treated as being part of the core of the deck. And then the rest we'll go through as sideboard options very, very shortly. So let's get this thing started by looking at the core cards here. So going to start with the reds to explain some of the rationale on those, and then go on to the blues. So our core contains 6 Aether Ice Veins. You will quickly see there are 2 yellow ones in our sideboard as well, for a total of 8. I play more Aether Ice Veins than most people, because I think that card is still exceptionally powerful. It is the best arcane attack you have, and I think you need more than just a small amount of red arcane spells to make Stormstriders very strong and a threat in the late game in a number of matchups, which is why those extra ones are there. They're also very beneficial in matchups where fusing them with Insidious Chills in play is the goal. So you'll see a number of matchups where we play the 2 yellow ones as well. Red Ice Vein is just the best arcane attack in the game. The disruption it provides is exceptionally strong. It blocks 3, 5 damage, the most you can get off of it. Still happy to play 3 of those. The rest of the reds that start in the core here are 3 copies of Enlightened Strike, 3 copies of Findle's Fighting Spirit, 3 Scarford's Scar, and 3 Wounded Bull. Now, for anyone who's been following the Bulllander lists, you'll know this is fairly stock. These are normally the attacks of choice in these scenarios because of the rates they push in terms of damage. They make your 2 cards worth 8 in a lot of spots. So, Scar for a Scar into an effect, or Scar for a Scar into a Wounded Bull or a Fighting Spirit are big push turns that allow you to push chunks of damage. Findle's Fighting Spirit, often going to gain your life and push 7, which means your 2 cards are worth 8 damage. Wounded Bull, often going to get that +1 because you're going to be behind on life, which means it is also 2 cards for 8 damage, which means your average card is worth 4, which is more than the 3 they would block for if they were blocking, which is a fantastic rate, and that is what you're looking to achieve with these cards. Don't be afraid to not keep an arsenal on several turns where you intend on playing these. You're going to find yourself often blocking with 2 cards, and looking to attack with a Wounded Bull, attack with a Fighting Spirit, and not keep an arsenal in those spots to pressure your opponent back. There'll also be a number of scenarios where you do pitch to Coronet Peak and arsenal the red to try and complete the same play pattern on the following turn, depending on the card in your hand. But that's a play pattern you should be familiar with, and one that will come up a lot. In a similar vein, Enlightened Strike, really good at being like 5 go again into a big attack, into a Wounded Bull or a Fighting Spirit. It can push 7 for 2 cards by itself, which is obviously a fantastic rate in those spots as well. But you'll often find yourself with this one keeping 2 cards, pushing 5 damage, and drawing a card, so that you get to keep an arsenal. Because for the most part, if you do that with Enlightened Strike, your arsenal is, on average, worth 3 damage, because you'll at least get a Waning Moon activation out of it. If not, push some more damage as well from the Frostbite, from damage on the card, whatever the situation might be. Which means 5 + 3 means Enlightened Strike also going to be worth 8, meaning it is 2 cards for 8 damage in a lot of spots, which makes it the other red attack of choice. You'll notice I've switched back to Scar for a Scar when I was quite vocal about playing Fate Foreseen in that slot, another card that is traditionally a 0 for 4, offering you the same kind of rate. The truth is, I found I only wanted Fate Foreseen in the Guardian matchups, and I wanted Scar for a Scar everywhere, and that ended up being the tiebreaker for the most part. Scar for a Scar, a bit of a liability sometimes into Stalagmite in the Oldhim matchup when people choose to bring it against you instead of playing Arcane Lantern. But I think you need to get through that Stalagmite eventually anyway. It is always going to block damage because you are playing other physical attacks. So suddenly not playing Scar for a Scar doesn't fix that and like avoid that problem. Same with the rest of their armor, truth be told. So I think because I found myself wanting to main deck Scar in most matchups, and I wanted to only play Fate Foreseen against the Guardians, that's why it got the nod in the slot for the red, because you can only play so many reds in this deck, of course. So that's your reds in the core. Now we go on to the real meat and potatoes of the core. Blues. Blue cards, obviously the super important things for Iyslander. You'll notice that most of the cards we start in every matchup are either ice cards, block 3, or both. And the reason for that is because I think blocking as Iyslander is very important. You want your cards to be worth as much as possible, and you are obviously starting on a lower life total than most people. So having 2 cards that blocks 3 is a very strong part of Iyslander's game plan. It's very easy to want to play cards like Winter's Bite, Arctic Incarceration that block 2. But you'll notice that, of course, now that we're playing red attacks instead of playing arcane damage effects, our attacks block for less. We've got a lot of block 2s in our deck already because of Wounded Bull, Scar for a Scar, Findle's Fighting Spirit, and that makes a lot of the block 2 cards that are ice blues way more of a liability because on average your hands just block significantly worse. In matchups like Fi, that's a real problem, and you need to keep that in mind. And you'll notice when we go into sideboarding a bit later on that some concessions, I should say, are made in order to bolster the block count in a number of spots, which is something to keep in mind. So we kind of talked about this a lot in our previous Iyslander deck techs, but for the most part, a lot of the cards that you're playing in every matchup are what we call ticking boxes. You're looking for blue cards that block 3 that have relevant abilities coming out of your arsenal. If it does that, it's probably good enough to just be played in every matchup. because blue, ice, block 3 are the most important things about your blue cards, for the most part. So in the case of Aether Hail, Ice Bolt, Frosting, these are all cheap blue damage effects that can be useful to you in the late game from your arsenal when you're trying to race. But for the most part, they are cheap blue, ice, block 3s. They tick as many boxes as humanly possible, and that is why you see them seeing play in the deck all the time. Channel Lake Frigid, unsurprisingly, just one of the best ice cards ever printed, likely will be for the rest of time. It is a blue ice block 3, which is fantastic. It's a little awkward coming out of the arsenal sometimes because it costs 2, which means you cannot Waning Moon alongside it, but it is just such a powerful disruptive effect against all these aggro decks. In the mirror as well, it's phenomenal in the mirror match, which is great. Sees play in a lot of places, very, very good against your Rune Blades as well. Unsurprisingly, just one of the best ice cards ever. You will play 3 in every matchup, because at the very worst, it is a non-attack action that is a blue ice block 3. That makes it good enough everywhere, regardless of the text box. Blue Aether Ice Veins, this is a card that I think you could definitely look to step away from if you see less and less aggro in the format. If the format gets more and more about Iyslander and Oldhim, a larger metagame share, this card's really good into aggro from the arsenal to disrupt them during their own turn, gives you more ways of fusing to trigger Insidious Chills in your own turn, and that can feel super relevant in a lot of spots. It is, again, at the very worst, a blue block 3, but for the most part, it is your blue damage of choice that disrupts the aggro decks, and it is less good against the less aggressive decks, and you'll block with it or pitch it more consistently in those spots. Only 2 Amulet of Ices. I see a lot of people still playing 3 Amulet of Ice. I cannot stand it. There are so many matchups where Amulet for me is only bonus copies of Insidious Chill or a 0-cost ice card to come out of my arsenal. It not blocking in a deck with so many block 2s often comes up as being like such a liability on turns where you really need to block, in my opinion. But it being a blue ice card that is very cheap out of the arsenal, that can give you one-time triggers of, you know, the Aether Ice Vein effect, the Insidious Trill effect, an effect that very clearly gets better in multiples, makes it worth playing, in my opinion. But I don't want to have any more than 3 cards that do not block in my main core in every matchup, and I think Heart of Fiendel remains better than the 3rd Amulet of Ice in matchups that go so grindy. We'll get into that one a little bit more when we get to it, but that is most of my rationale for only playing 2 copies of Amulet of Ice. I think the effect is strong as a one-shot, but it really can be a liability. I think the 3rd one does you a number of unsavory favours over the course of a 16-round event. Cold Snap here, we're going to bundle in alongside Polar Blast. We're also playing 3 of these in our main deck in every single matchup. Iyslander these days is a lot more about tempo. You play a tempo game plan into nearly every matchup, even Guardians now a lot of the time, just because they're more aggressive, and most decks that aren't control decks, you want to be blocking strategically while chipping damage with Waning Moon, because at the end of the day, if you can keep life totals close to each other, you're the one with Stormstriders, and that means you're going to win that race because you get to time walk them in a spot where you think that's particularly reasonable to pump extra damage into your opponent. Cold Snap and Polar Blast are the single 2 best cards for triggering Waning Moon during your opponent's turn because they replace themselves. They draw a card coming out of the arsenal. They cost 1, which means if you pitch a blue to it, the 2 that you have remaining will pay for Waning Moon, which means you still have a 4-card hand, your opponent got a Frostbite, and you did 3 damage for free, essentially. And that is the main reason you play both of those cards. Essentially, they read, make a Frostbite, deal 3 damage to your opponent for 0, a lot of the time. Which is obviously a fantastic effect you want as many of as you can, which will come up later, so we'll talk about that in just a bit. They are ice cards, which means, you know, super important for fusing. They are just fantastic. They are great on rates. They let you do the chip tempo play as often as possible without losing any cards. And the effects of both do come up in this deck. Cold Snap is the better of the 2. If you've got to choose between arsenaling in most spots, you will arsenal Cold Snap, because freezing allies against Dromai matters, freezing arsenal cards that could be pummels against Guardian, or big attacks from Phi. These are all semi-relevant effects, so Cold Snap definitely the better one. But every now and then, you will indeed play Polar Blast from your arsenal in your own turn if you intend on playing a Fighting Spirit or a Wounded Bull, because your opponent will never ever pay to stop you having Dominate. And sometimes an 8 Dominate is exactly what you need on any given turn. So both are somewhat relevant effects. So they have that upside with them too, but they are mostly here as 0-cost cards that deal 3 damage. Emeritus Scolding. This is kind of a card that I'm very sour on in general, but it is a necessary evil to combat, well, not to combat, but to go along with this game plan of pushing damage and being a tempo deck. Emeritus Scolding is the card that allows you to push the most damage from your arsenal as a blue, because there is no other way of pushing 7 alongside Waning Moon. The problem is, without a Tunic resource, that often costs you 2 cards, because Emeritus Scolding costs 2, which means it kind of suffers from that Ice Bolt problem of, not playing well with Waning Moon without having an extra resource spare or extra cards in hand to get rid of. That being said, because you are now mostly a tempo deck, Emeritus Scolding is just super important. You need to be able to push large amounts of damage in the late game. And again, the downside of the card being in your deck is really not that high. It is a blue block 3 at the very worst if you don't want to arsenal it. Which, again, is a pretty reasonable bar for a card that is making the cut these days. It is worth the rate. Don't arsenal it aggressively early. Apart from like the mirror match, it's pretty good to arsenal early there. But for the most part, you don't want to get it stuck. Getting it stuck in your arsenal can be really dangerous. You would much rather block with it, pitch it away for later, or try and arsenal it on turns where you have a Tunic resource available to get that perfect like 7. Yeah. Frost Hex. Frost Hex is a big sad moment, honestly, for me. For the most part, this card is just a blue Ice Block 3 at this point, which ticks enough boxes for it to always see play, as we kind of talked about earlier on. But sadly, this obviously used to be your main win condition in the Guardian matchups, and I just don't think that's the case anymore. I think so many of the Guardian lists you see are so aggressive now, so many red attacks, very much a lot more pummels, like up to 7 pummels sometimes, and you cannot afford to take that much damage and try and set up all these combo pieces at the same time. Because they will just kill you with a dominated attack or something once you get down to like 7, 8, 9. Because you've been taking hits from pummel or hits from your opponent's attack to keep a Frost Hex to play. It just isn't as viable as it used to be, which is a real shame for people that enjoy that play pattern. That being said, you do still need it as a tool in those matchups to make your opponents respect it. If you find your opponent is playing very, very slowly, maybe aiming for a fatigue plan, you're still going to want to try and set this thing up. And you will find that your end game in a lot of Guardian matchups still comes down to like 1 or 2 Frost Hexes alongside an Ice Eternal to do that final burst of damage, like stripping cards out of their hand. It just comes up a lot less, which is a shame, but the card is still necessary to have that avenue in the slower matchups. And again, at very worst, Blue Ice Block 3 can only ever be so bad, which is kind of a testament to itself. Very much the same. We kind of talked about Ice Bolt and Frosting a minute ago. They are just the best cheap blue Ice Block 3s that provide you with some damage. Insidious Chill, the last card in the core here that we need to talk about. Insidious Chill is one of the strongest cards Iyslander has to play. It is sadly not quite as good as it used to be just because the format is so aggressive right now. These lists also have less things to fuse in them, stereotypically, because you are playing more red physical attacks instead of playing things like Freezing Point or Encase, which turn this on more consistently. That being said, they are still fantastic in a number of matchups for stripping cards alongside Aether Ice Vein, alongside Brain Freeze, alongside Ice Eternal. There are a number of things you're happy to fuse to trigger this, especially during your opponent's turn in a number of matchups. And it's still an important part of a lot of those plans. Again, at the very worst, Blue Ice card, it does block 2, makes it a bit of a liability at times, but you're allowed to have a certain number of those, even though admittedly the number in this list is a little higher than I would like it to be, because of the red physical attacks. I do think Insidious Chill far too strong in the big 3 matchups for the most part, and therefore you cannot afford to let it go. So looking at the equipment suite that we play in the majority of matchups, nothing has changed here for the most part. Waning Moon remains the best weapon you have available to you in a number of spots. Just there's nothing like it. It is the best on rate for pushing damage in both your own and your opponent's turn. You should be activating this more than you were before, arguably. There are a number of matchups where Waning Moon is just your win condition because you are a solid tempo deck looking to chip damage in at every possible opportunity with as many like 1-cost cards from your arsenal that replace themselves by drawing a card. Yeah, it is just kind of a basic part, not words are hard. I apologize. It's very late, obviously, before the flight. The deck is built around it. You're fundamentally built to abuse Waning Moon as a weapon. You wouldn't play anything else. Coronet Peak is still a card that people are not using enough. It will win you games in the more aggressive matchups. And the best way I can think to phrase this, think about what your opponent's average card is worth. If we look at a average Briar turn, let's not look at something insane, no Channel Mount Heroics, no super high rolls or anything, but an average turn, something like Earthlore Surge into Snatch, Earthlore Surge into Nimblism, into Snatch, into Rosetta Thorn, or something like this. Their average card is worth like 4 damage, right? Maybe even 4.25. If you start looking at some of the Earthlore Surge turns, significantly more if you're looking at Channel Mount Heroic turns, because most of their attacks attack for 4, just like by themselves, 0 for 4s. And then you're adding on like the extra bonus of Rosetta Thorn at the end. You've got this Earthlore Surge giving it additional value. So if you look at it and consider that your opponent's average card is worth 4 damage in this matchup, much like Fi, maybe the average card is worth 4 there as well. Coronet Peak basically says, pitch a card that blocks 3, prevent 4 damage. Which of course turns your block 3 into a block 4, which is good. That's a fantastic rate if you intend on having no other actions, and will help you soak up damage in the long run. Activating Coronet Peak, stripping cards from your opponent will save you life. Just be mindful of your opponent's tunic, so they don't get to just keep using their tunic to pay for your Coronet Peak activations, and you strip them of no cards. That's a much worse exchange. But it is just still the best headpiece you have in nearly every matchup. It blocks 2 and has Blade Break, which is of course just fantastic as well, because you will need to block with it eventually, nearly always when you start getting down to those final turns where both players' life totals are very tight, and you're looking to set up a big Stormstrider's turn. Findle's Spring Tunic remains the single best chess piece you can play in most matchups. This is going to be paying for a number of different cards. Sometimes it will pay for Cold Snap's Polar Blast so that you have a 5-card hand. That does come up on occasion. But for the most part, this will pay for Ironhide Gauntlets on a turn when you need to do that. If you can't find a way to have a spare resource floating, it will pay the 1 for your Stormstriders, which is really important on those final turns, and you're looking to keep as many cards as possible to inflict damage to your opponent. Yeah, it is pretty great at all of those things. It will also do a good job of letting you bypass Frostbites in the mirror or against Oldhim when you're looking to play a 3-cost attack. There are a number of times, for example, where Oldhim will swing a Frosty Winter's Wail at you. You have 2 cards in your hand, a blue and a Wounded Bull, or a blue and a Fighting Spirit. You can then afford to take the Frostbite and activate your Tunic and still get to attack with your big attack without getting punked by like Stalagmite or an Ice reaction. And that's a play pattern that comes up quite a lot in that matchup, so the Tunic resource is worth a fair bit over there as well. Tunic is Tunic. It is the best generic chess piece for a reason. It's super flexible, pays for a lot of very important things in the deck, and you'll wear it in most matchups. Ironhide Gauntlet. Sad this is still the best option we have, unfortunately, I think for the most part. I've seen some people gravitating towards Goliath Gauntlet alongside Wounded Bull and Fighting Spirit. I don't think that's correct. I think for the most part you are going to be more defensive than your opponent in most matchups. You will have a spare resource floating courtesy of Tunic, or a turn where you didn't get to Waning Moon, or you choose to pitch a pitch 3 to Waning Moon your opponent, trade 3, block for 3 damage, and you want to have a resource left after that, you have something to do with it. I tend to find for me at the moment, there are obviously matchups where I try and hold on to Ironhide Gauntlet for as long as I can, to block dominated attacks and similar things against Guardian, for example. But as a general rule, outside of those matchups, I try and weave it in to my blocks where I have a resource to pay for it. And sometimes that's just, hey, my Tunic is free right now, I don't see myself popping Stormstriders in the next 3 turns, it will get back there. And sometimes it is just, hey, I have a resource left over after I paid for Arcane Barrier. I don't think I'm likely to have too many resources left over for the rest of this game. Let's use this while I have the ability to do so. And that tends to be how I treat Ironhide Gauntlets. And of course, Stormstriders. Well, Stormstriders is insane. They banned it in Blitz for a reason. It is a large part of Wizard's identity. It's essentially a time walk for you Magic fans out there, because you get to take an extra turn whenever you decide it's time for you to do so, to try and push damage into your opponent at instant speed once they start giving up cards to pressure you during their own turn. It's bananas, and I would never play Wizard in CC without it while it's legal. It's just a huge part of the way the deck is built, and I think that's fairly self-explanatory, to be completely honest. Going to start going into the 27 sideboard cards that we have available to us in this list, and here is where you'll start seeing some of the more interesting inclusions in this version of Iyslander that aren't typical of the Bull Lander deck for most people. First of all, we're going to look at the 3 arcane attacks that you see in my sideboard here in the copies of Yellow Aether Icebane and the single copy of Freezing Point. There are a number of matchups where I bring in the Yellow Aether Icebanes. We'll go into that during the sideboard breakdown. I want another arcane attack in those matchups because having an access to Stormstriders in the late game is so important. And I don't think the Red Icebanes alone or the Emeritus Scoldings do enough in those spots. I also think Aether Icebane is very strong at ripping people's hands apart, and there are a number of matchups where that's an effect that I desperately want, alongside my Insidious Chills. I want more cards that can trigger my Insidious Chill. And at the very worst, it's a block 3 that I can pitch to Waning Moon. It still pays for that in a pinch, which is why it is the arcane attack that gets selected. I would likely play 3 of them if it wasn't specifically for the Oldhim matchups, where I feel like I'm doing something here that not a lot of people are. A lot of Oldhims at the moment feel like they can be safe as long as they are above 10, right? Because if you Stormstriders plus 5 damage, plus Emeritus Scolding for 9 damage, plus Moon for 12, you know, they got AB3 at the very minimum, or AB2 plus Crown, they can't die. They know as long as they're above 10, your maximum damage turn does not kill them if they have a blue in their hand. And that leads them to making some very greedy plays when they're at 10. And I think, well, at least I found in my testing anyway, having access to a single copy of Freezing Point is a huge punish in a lot of spots where people think they have free real estate. It's another attack that fuses against Oldhim specifically. But you can also make this card do way more than the damage from any other card. Because you can like combo it with Ice Eternal, you can have it deal 6 off of Stormstriders even if you just play an Ice card from your arsenal and nothing else, even if you aren't playing Ice Eternal. And of course it has the wild combo potential alongside things like, you know, small weird circumstances like freezing cards with Cold Snap, for example, dealing an extra point of damage as a result of that. Yeah, that's most of that. Obviously, if you have Frost Hexes on them, those count too, which you will occasionally, and I say somewhat often, have at least the 1 to 2 Frost Hexes on your Oldhim opponent over the course of a game that goes particularly long. I feel like having access to Freezing Point somewhere in my deck in the matchup where I tend to go through nearly all of my deck by the time that it's over, it gives me the ability to punk people who think they're safe at 10, because Freezing Point can push upwards of 8-9 damage with a little bit of setup, which if you can have it alongside an Arsenal and a Waning Moon, kills them in spots where they go for greedy pummel plays or greedy big attacks that they tend to think they're safe and cannot die in those spots. So I love having the 1 Freezing Point, just the 1. I don't want any more at this moment in time, but it gets the nod over the 3rd Ice Vein for that reason, for specifically the Oldhim matchup. We have this anti-aggro package that comes in most of the aggressive matchups that you're going to see here, and those are mostly what this list is tailored towards. I expect a lot of Fi, like a lot of Fi at Worlds, so I've gamed myself more towards that matchup than Oldhim, truth be told. So Blizzard, Brain Freeze, Hypothermia, and then I guess the somewhat big one, This Round's on Me, a card that is not typically seen in too many of these Iyslander decks. Blizzard and Hypothermia, I think they're fairly self-explanatory. They are the best ice interaction cards you can play from your arsenal. Hypothermia are obviously super cheap. Turns on Waning Moon at no cost. Very, very strong into Briar specifically, because you're able to shut them down off of Embodiment of Lightnings, a lot of their attacks that have no natural go again, which makes it much stronger there than Blizzard. However, Hypothermia are not typically as good against Fi, assuming they aren't on Kodachi Fi. If they're on Kodachi Fi, obviously the card is insane. But for the most part, you have to get it to line up with their Searing Emberblade against traditional Fi, because they have a lot of natural go again, which can make it not quite as much of an all-star in that matchup. Blizzard, I tend to find, is definitely worth the spot. A lot of people respect it these days. They will play around it. They will hold a blue so they can keep going over the course of the turn. Blizzard really shines when you can pair it with something else, is the way I tend to find it. You need it to be alongside an ice card in your arsenal to get the 4th taxation point on your opponent's turn, so that a blue kind of like doesn't cover it by itself. And those are the spots where it really shines. But it's obviously very good at shutting down those Art of War turns. It's insane versus like Dash, for example, much like Hypothermia is as well, at shutting off those pistol turns. Means it makes the cut in a lot of those matchups. It is still one of the best options you have if you're looking for an effect that is able to shut that all down and be an anti-aggro tool. I love Brain Freeze. Brain Freeze is a card that I've been playing in Iyslander since the beginning. It is, again, at the very worst, a blue block 3 0 cost card, which means it can only ever be so bad. But the upsides of Brain Freeze, you can do some silly things with this card from your arsenal. If your opponent's on fire, you can steal their Phoenix Flame. Viscerai, you can steal the card they're about to spellbound creepers into play before they get the opportunity to do so. Even against things like Brutes, taking away barraging beatdowns, super relevant. But yeah, for the most part, this is for those aggro decks. There's the cards that the decks that play a lot of zero cost cards, basically. And the reason it gets the nod there is because it's very good at sniping cards in spots where you need to take a card from your opponent. So, for example, you take away a card against Briar, it essentially blocks 4 because it took a card away that would have dealt 4 damage. But it also has even more upside. It is a blue block 3 at the worst, and it does have Ice Fusion, which means in matchups where you want something to trigger your Insidious Chills, and you want a cheap effect that can do that, especially during your opponent's turn, where fusing your Insidious Chills gets much more powerful, Brain Freeze can do that for you, which is why it gets the nod in those spots as well. We're on 2 energy potions. 2 has always been the magic number for me. I find in a lot of the matchups where you want to draw an E-pot, you want to draw exactly 1. And playing exactly 1 means you might not find it soon enough, and often you can find it too late. Playing 3 means you can get clogged up on them and get stuck with cards in your hand that don't block. Playing 2 means you find 1 as quickly as possible with the ability to avoid those issues, which is why 2 has always kind of been the magic number for me. E-pot gets better right now. It's really good in the Oldhim matchups to not only set up those combo kills if you're given the option, so you can still set up the big Ice Eternal Frost Hex kills in those matchups, but of course you get to break through Stalagmite, which is a thing that never really happened before. Having an energy potion in play does a very good Tunic impression, at letting you ignore Stalagmite's block giving you a Frostbite, ignore the Winter's Wail giving you a Frostbite on a turn where you want to block with 2 cards but still play a Wounded Bull. Which gives you some great flexibility. It's obviously insane in the mirror. Having on board AB that you don't have to keep cards in your hand to pay for. Breaking through opposing Frostbites if there's Frost Hexes in play. Spending more cards on Arcane Barrier, still being able to pop it and play a Wounded Bull or a Fighting Spirit back off your Tunic. These are all things that happen somewhat frequently in the mirror match. I've even had spots where it just pays for Metacarpus Node on big turns where I need extra resources to juice my attacks up. Which is definitely a thing that happens there as well. So 2 E-Pots for me, the magic number, plays a lot of roles in a lot of matchups. Ice Eternal is no longer part of the core of this deck. It's kind of weird to say that, but Ice Eternal is a necessary evil. It's got to be in your deck somewhere, because there are a number of matchups where having the effect to generate chunks of Frostbites is important. Mostly Oldhim, of course, alongside Freezing Point and those combo kill turns with Frost Hex, for example. But even in matchups where you care more about what turn 0 looks like and you don't want to let your opponent filter, sometimes you can just play an Ice Eternal 4-0, not 4-0, sorry, an Ice Eternal, pitch your hand into it, not fuse it so they can't pitch to Arcane Barrier, just start their turn with 4-5 Frostbites in play, which can actually be a really solid start against a deck like 5, for example, if they don't have the ability to activate 5's ability to break through them on turn 0. But definitely very, very sweet against like Briar, for example, where you can just make 4 Frostbites and be like, go ahead, I guess. Which is a very, very strong line there. And there are also just a number of matchups where you want it as a 0 cost thing that fuses, which definitely comes up in the matchups where you're relying on Amulet of Ice, relying on Insidious Chill to do things, and having more cards that fuse there matter. But the truth is, you don't go for those big combo turns anywhere near as often as you did in old school Iyslander. So for the most part, it's a blue block 3, and it has no text in those matchups. So it starts in a lot of matchups, don't get me wrong. You'll still play it in a lot of places because it is just perfectly fine, even if it has no real upside. But it doesn't start everywhere because we play enough blues that are better than it in certain matchups that it gets sacrificed for space reasons. It's not like particularly bad in those matchups, we just no longer have room for it because we're playing other cards. The one defense reaction I still make space for is Sink Below. Sink Below is insane. It is a 0-4. It gets you 4 value for your single card. Lets you fix hands that are a little bit too red heavy. Answers Winter's Wail particularly well. 1 card for 1 card. Doesn't hit that break point. And is equally good at doing that with other cards like, Snatch or, any of the other 0-4s. There's millions of them at this point. Just answers them for a single card, which gives you a great exchange rate while fixing your hand and letting you have more information moving forward. A lot of people I've seen are playing this into Iyslander currently because of all the red attacks that you can assume that nearly every single list is on. I do not. I try and keep my red count as low as possible in the Iyslander matchup. I try to be the more proactive player, which you'll see in our sideboard in a little bit. And that means sink below feels like a bit of a liability to me. And I'm always a little worried about getting caught off guard by my opponent, like boarding out their Scar for Scars or some of their big attacks, or just being a red Ice Bolt deck and playing a traditional Arcane Iyslander. And I've just got this completely blank card in my deck that's a huge liability when I draw it because it pitches like crap. So it doesn't make the cut in my sideboard guide currently, but I'm sure if I see some, moves from people during Worlds that make me think that's worthwhile, maybe I'll adjust that on the fly on the day. And then possibly the most interesting card in this list, in my opinion, this round's on me. We actually found this about 2 weeks ago in my playtesting process, started testing it with my team, and then the Battle Hardened in Denver that I was lucky enough to do commentary on was had Margin Bay make top 8. And Margin Bay was also playing 3 of these in his deck, which gave me some serious validation on an idea that I'd already been testing, but admittedly was pretty sour on. I had tested it out and was like, I don't think it's quite good enough. I think I'm going to let it go. And the validation from seeing him do well with it made me feel like I wasn't alone and I wasn't just, lost in the sauce. So I went back to it, and I have solidified it in my deck that I've locked in for the event. We are playing this round on me, and now we'll explain to you why. So this card does a lot of things. It's here for a lot of reasons. If we look at the baseline of this card once again, it's a blue block 3 at the very worst. Which again, decent baseline, not terrible. This is secretly copies Polar Blast and Cold Snap, like 7 through 9. In matchups where tempo is super, super important, this is another 1-cost non-attack action that can come out of your arsenal instant speed, that replaces itself by drawing a card, leaves you with 2 resources to activate Waning Moon. That matters. That's a line of play you'll take fairly often with this card. Does your opponent drawing an extra card matter? Yes. Of course it does. But in matchups like Fi and Briar, if you can play this at the right time and reduce the power of their attacks, you will get more than 1 card's worth of value out of that, especially given that you are also drawing an extra card, which can, of course, block as well. For the most part, however, this is Polar Blast and Cold Snaps number 7 through 9 to let you validate those plays extra. You can definitely pull this off at the end of the turn too. You'll have a lot of spots, for example, where maybe you have 1 card left in hand, it's a blue that you don't really want to arsenal. Your opponent's held a card to play around Arcane, so they have a card left over, and they were going to move to Arsenal anyway. So you're not giving them an extra card to Arsenal in those spots. You can play this round on me, look to Waning Moon if you have the spare resources available. Maybe you use those resources on something else earlier in the turn, like Ironhide Gauntlets, perhaps, before playing it. And then you're not giving them the extra card to Arsenal. You're getting an extra card in your hand. Maybe find something else you'd rather Arsenal. But for the most part, this also sees a lot of play on turn 0 and turn 1 of like the Briar and Fi matchups. Because playing this early, much like I discussed in my Blitz deck tech, if you check that one out for Briar, you can play this on turn 0 and turn off your opponent's turns. Do a lot of thing where you just like attack afterwards, and they don't keep the 5th card because they're blocking you. Or if they don't block you, you don't care about the 5th card because you pushed like 5 damage or 7 damage off of a Fighting Spirit or 8 damage off of a Wounded Bull in those spots. In their first turn with all their Phoenix Flames and the smaller attacks, or in Briar's case, all these 4 power attacks that are now 3 power attacks and don't have a breakpoint to leak damage, are a lot easier to block, which means this thing is fantastic to play early. And it can also be a real surprise in those matchups out of the Arsenal too. I've had like a lot of games against like Fi, for example, where my opponent has like played a Mounting Anger, and this round's on me stops that hit trigger. Or played an Art of War to try and score a hit trigger on a snatch that's like being blocked by a Sink Below, or being blocked for 4 with a piece of armor, and this round's on me stops the Art of War, counteracts that plus, and stops that hit trigger from happening. And these are all relevant things that happen with this card, in addition to the fact it blocks 3, which neither Polar Blast nor Cold Snap do. And it is another version of that effect that's going to let you pay 1 to draw a card and deal 3 damage. And that is what makes it make the cut, in my opinion. It is great in a number of matchups for that reason. You'll see there's a number of matchups we play it as the highest opportunity blue as well, because again, It just blocks 3 where we want it to block 3, and sometimes it's going to have relevant game text. And that is why we're playing this round Omni. The rest of our sideboard is 4 pieces of equipment that you'll see for various matchups. Alluvian Constellus is for the wizard matchups, the mirror, and for Kano. You'll also wear it against Viserai, because against Viserai you want to be able to win in Moon for free as often as you can, and they are pushing serious amounts of arcane damage into you, which makes it the best arcane barrier piece for you to have available in that matchup, so that you're able to essentially race, keep tempo, keep life totals as close as you possibly can, and have Stormstriders finish that game at the very end, which is what makes Alluvian Constellus so powerful there. Crown of Providence is for Oldhim and Oldhim only, because in the Oldhim matchup you never ever want to use Coronet Peak. There are just no spots where a single card is worth a card from your opponent's hand, because their turns are often so efficient. They can Crown of Seas to generate extra resources. Like, a lot of their problematic attacks are just like 3 for 7s, which take 2 cards anyway. And then they still get to Arsenal to trigger, like, to turn on Crown of Seeds because they kept a 3rd card. It's not good enough to ever Coronet Peak them in those matchups. It doesn't do anything relevant anymore because they're so aggressive. Coronet Peak used to be very solid into Oldhim when they were Fatigue, but that's just not so much the case anymore. And you'll also find yourself often being in spots in the Oldhim matchup where you need to block with your armor now. Your opponent might fuse an Oakenold, might send a dominated attack at you that you want to keep cards in your hand, and you need to soak up damage. Or even if you don't want to keep cards in your hand, you just need to soak up damage. And so you're going to block pretty aggressively in that matchup, which means Crown of Providence blocking for 2 there is going to be the same value, of course, as Coronet Peak blocking, but we get this extra upside of being able to filter through our cards, maybe flip our arsenal away into another card to block with in a pinch, or just filter through to find another blue, maybe turn a blue into a red if we're looking for ways to pressure back after we block this dominated attack. Or maybe we're just looking for a better card to Arsenal on the following turn going forward. Maybe a 0-cost card we can play out of our hand because we still have an Arsenal. A lot of reasons why you might want to Crown of Providence and filter in those spots. Maybe you just want to pitch stack and set up a card next to something else you know is on the bottom of your deck. That will also come up on occasion, which makes Crown a valuable asset in that matchup. Metacarpus Node is here, of course, for the matchups where you want Arcane Barrier. So again, the Wizard matchups, the Mirror and Kano. But it's also here for Briar and for Dromai. In the Briar matchup, you can't afford to give up your Tunic. The Tunic resource is very important for your endgame strategies and some of your mid-game turns. So your choice of AB has to be somewhere else on the body, which means you choose to give up your arms instead of blocking 2. You'll often block more than 2 with Arcane Barrier over the course of the game. And you'll also find, because Briar can be quite a race-style matchup, that the end of the game will often be decided with Metacarpus Node adding some extra damage to your stuff, which makes it a very valuable asset in that matchup. Against Dromai, kind of the same thought process, really. The Tunic is more valuable than Alluvian Constellus by a significant margin. You do want some Arcane Barrier because of Burn Them All and Azalea, mainly, being the offenders that will leak Arcane damage onto you as the game goes on. You want to be able to pop your shoes aggressively in that matchup when it's required, so you don't want to rely on that to pay for Arcane Barrier. And also, most importantly, Metacarpus Node thrives for being a buff in that matchup, because Dromai is a race. You are trying to dump red damage into them as quickly as you possibly can, because that is the only thing that matters against Dromai. Which means Metacarpus Node matters. The buff will matter in winning you games out of nowhere. You'll also find, for example, that some Dromai lists are playing Thamai, or some of the bigger dragons that are really problematic for you, and kind of turn off your natural game plan. And in those spots, you need Metacarpus Node to be able to perhaps juice one of your blues up to enough of a level to be able to take that off the table in a pinch if you don't have a red that you can spare to throw at it, which really does come up way more than you think. So Metacarpus Node, Wizard Mirrors, Briar, Dromai. And last but not least, we have a Nolrun Hood. Nolrun Hood here just for the Wizard Mirrors, because in those matchups you do want access to AB5. A lot of people considering playing some armor to be able to block the big attacks out of Iyslander. It isn't worth it. For the most part, you would rather be able to block an entire Red Aether Ice Vein, so you need AB5 to have the ability to do that, which having Nolrun Hood gives you. And I think it's definitely worth the slot as a result. So, there you go. If all you wanted was the list, you're not worried about the sideboard guide so much. There it is. Everything you could possibly want to know about the list I'm playing at Worlds. It is in the description box for you below. You can go and export it. Grab your own copy, play it on Talishar, try it out for yourself. But I am now going to try and take some time to break through these sideboard plans for you. I'm going to obviously have this available for you in the description box. So if you just want to import it and try the sideboard plan out for yourself, check it out down there in Talishar. You could do that. But I'm going to break down the thought process on a number of these cards here as well in each and every matchup. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to start by showing you the cards that are not in your deck in each matchup. So you should know what is left in your deck box when you sleeve things up and go to start. And then I'll kind of highlight the cards that did get brought in and kind of explain why they are the ones that that get the nod in that matchup. And hopefully that's beneficial all around. So, Azalea to start with. The cards you do not wish to be in your deck against Azalea. 3 Blizzards, 2 E-Pots and the Freezing Point, 3 Hypothermias, 2 This Round's on Me, and the equipment that is not for this matchup. Those are the cards you want left. So, bit of a weird number here. We're playing a single copy of This Round's on Me. The reason for this is because we want to up our blue count in this matchup by 1. And it's a blue that blocks 3, which makes it better than all the remaining options we have in our list currently. You won't play it very often in this matchup. It is going to be, the 7th copy of Polar Blast Cold Snap in some spots when you want a Waning Moon, but for the most part it's a blue block 3, and blocking against Azalea is important. Hypothermia Blizzard just not required against a deck that is mostly going tall instead of going wide. E-Pots don't block, and you have no reason to want extra resources in this matchup, and Freezing Point is, of course, for those more controlling matchups. We do not want that point of Arcane here. So you'll see, initially from this sideboard guide, in most matchups, one of the 2 OVs comes into the deck, followed by a selection of 3 OVs. You'll find that we tend to play Yellow Ice Vein or Energy Potion in a lot of matchups as the 2 OV that we bring in. And in some matchups, you will cut things to make space for both. But most of the time, you're looking to be pretty elegant. So in case you didn't notice when we looked at the default, we're a 48 card core, which means we're looking to board in 12 cards in a number of spots. So you'll find that a 2 OV pairs very well with one of the 1 OVs, upping the blue count, for example. Or if you wanted one of the 1 OVs, like a Freezing Point, for example, that fits in nice and snug. It means sideboarding's pretty clean, basically. It's probably what I'm trying to say. I'm doing it in a roundabout way. But for the most part, you'll find that you want a 2 OV and a 1 OV, or you want both 2 OVs, which you can adapt accordingly. So, yeah. This matchup, we want the Yellow Ice Veins. Damage is important against Azalea. You're going to want to be able to have those extra effects to be able to Storm Striders when they go for a big Dominate attack, in my opinion. Red attack's just not quite enough juice by themselves. The other cards that make the cut in this matchup are very much kind of expected, to be completely honest, in terms of the things that we're bringing in. So Brain Freeze. Brain Freeze is a blue block 3, much like the copy of This Round's on Me. But it can have relevant game text by taking away cards like Seek and Destroy, Read the Glide Path, Nimbalism. These are all buff effects that, honestly, Brain Freeze can be super painful into Azalea because they can try and activate Azalea's ability, and you can respond. And if you respond to that and stick a card on top of their deck, they don't get to flip a Dominated Arrow into the arsenal like maybe they were expecting, which is a very powerful effect in this matchup. And at the very worst is a blue block 3, so definitely worth playing in this one for sure. We played the Ice Eternals. This is mostly because it is, again, another blue block 3 to up that blue count to a significant level. You don't play this all that often, but again, relevant game text sometimes in a lot of spots is going to allow you to kind of like shut off a turn if you're able to make 4 Frostbites, 5 Frostbites in one burst. And Azalea sometimes struggles to play buffs and get an arrow through all of that. The deck can be quite resource intense, and giving them a large number of Frostbites can be very, very powerful in a spot like that, which means it is the one that makes the cut. We're playing Sink Below, unsurprisingly. Sink Below defense reactions very strong into Azalea to stop those hit triggers that matter, especially things like, again, buffed arrows with Seek and Destroy or things like this that are very, very impactful into Iyslander. So just having defense reactions, unsurprisingly, pretty good against Dominate, arrows. Kind of makes a lot of sense once you've been playing the game for a while. As I say, the single copy of This Round's on Me, making the cut here as another blue block 3 that is the 7th copy of Cold Snap and Polar Blast. Really simple stuff. Hopefully that makes a number of sense. A number being arbitrary. Boltyn. Boltyn, a matchup that is very, very, very favoured for Iyslander. It's kind of hard to go particularly wrong here. The 2 of that we choose in this matchup is the Yellow Aether Ice Vein. We want more damage when we're trying to... so essentially, stripping cards out of Boltyn's hand is very good, because obviously he has to keep so many things together to charge. Maybe he wants to try and keep combo pieces safe so he can arsenal them and try and set up the big Luminar Ascension thing. So attacks that strip the opponent's hand against Boltyn, very strong. Definitely something that you want to be considering. Blizzard. can often just shut down the Luminous Ascension turn all by itself, which is kind of ridiculous. Brain Freeze, same thing. Sometimes you just Brain Freeze their hand when they start comboing off. Their second Lumina is still in hand. They pop their Courage. You put it on top of the deck. They don't want to attack, so they have to charge a Lumina. It's like really bad news all round. Brain Freeze, very, very good against Boltyn. So definitely a card you'd want to play in this matchup. Hypothermia, same deal. Unsurprisingly, again, just Sabers don't have natural go again. So if you Hypothermia out of the arsenal on the big combo turn, they just don't get to hit you, which is pretty disgusting. And a card that is definitely worth playing in the matchup. And then last but not least, again, rounding out the blue count with an extra copy of This Round's on Me, bringing up to 7 copies of Polar Blast and Cold Snap. Now, I keep mentioning the 7th copy of that effect, and I'm not sure why I've explained why that's important, so I'm going to break that down real quick why I remember. 7's a bit of a magic number, in my opinion, with Fab, in that it increases your ratios of drawing 1 per hand to a very significant number. Like, the chance of it happening increases significantly by playing the 7th copy, which is something we used to do with Riftbind back in Chain. In CC sometimes at least I did, and I know a number of other people did as well, to kind of improve your ratios of hitting a Riftbind every turn from your shackles, and that's kind of the same thought process here in a lot of cases. I want the 7th copy of that 1 cost draw a card, deal 3 damage effect, and This Round's on Me again, blocking 3 can only ever be so bad. Very rarely going to get played in this matchup, but if it does, I mean, it's also not particularly bad on that combo turn. You just strip 5-6 damage away from your opponent's burst because their attacks all have -1, which is definitely something as well. So not enough space to play all of them, but definitely a worthwhile one-off that we are pretty happy to have in this list to keep that blue count where we want it. You'll see, for example, in a lot of these matchups, our blue count is somewhere between 42, 43. Very, very happy to have that amount, to be honest. 2 yellows as well. You just don't need that many reds. And that's kind of how most of these matchups go. Very, very happy to be at 42, 43. Bravo here, another matchup where we make some different concessions, and the space thing works out for us because we want all of our non-3-off sideboard cards, because we kind of want the Ice Veins, the E-Pots, and the Freezing Point. But we'll get into that in just a second. Cards that should be in your deck box here that you really don't want in this matchup: Blizzard, Brain Freeze, Hypothermia. Makes a whole lot of sense, truth be told. None of those cards are very good into Bravo. Your equipment suite is very much what you would expect in this matchup. It turns out Coronet Peak in this matchup is good enough to be played over Crown, because stripping a card away from Bravo is way more impactful than stripping a card away from Oldhim. Not only do his attacks tend to cost more, but also, if he has spare resources, he just dominates attacks at you, which is bad. Attacks being dominated at you is bad. So Coronet Peaking to turn that off really can be quite relevant in the Bravo matchup, in my experience. The single copy of This Round's on Me, again, makes the cut because you are looking for that 7th copy of that effect, but it also just a blue block 3. We're going to be saying that a lot when we see 1 copy of this. It's the case in a lot of matchups. 3 Sync Belows, it's Guardian with dominated attacks. This is an effect that we want. I think that's fairly self-explanatory, I hope. Fingers crossed. As I say, the other ones up here, the single Freezing Point, again, more of a grindy matchup in a number of spots, which makes me think Freezing Point is definitely worth it. It's not quite as good here as it is against Oldhim, for sure, because some of Bravo's attacks you can't really afford to Freezing Point and make Frostbites off your Storm Striders and block, because they're bigger. Like, some of the problematic ones, like Crippling Crush, they can be very, very large. And that's an issue to block sometimes when you're on very, very low life totals. It is still, in my opinion, good enough, because, again, Bravos tend to have the same thing as Oldhim, where they have access to AB3 in some capacity. They feel safe when they're above 10. You want to be able to punish with that. E-Pot, again, definitely worth it in this matchup. You're going to be finding yourself wanting extra resources an awful lot, knocking around to be able to pay for stuff because you're blocking so aggressively. It's really going to be quite solid at setting up a pseudo Frost Hex kill in a number of spots as well. Doesn't happen quite as often as Bravo, as it used to, but you will find you still get to endgame spots where a single copy of Frost Hex is in play, and that extra damage is adding up because they're spending their entire hand to dominate attacks and send them at you, or to pummel attacks that they've sent at you, which means you can squeak in damage off Waning Moon and so on and so forth. Makes this very much worth it, even though, again, definitely a little dangerous to have so many cards that block 0 in the deck, and worth keeping in mind for sure. We bring in the Ice Eternals in this matchup. Again, you will occasionally set up a Frost Hex kill, so definitely worth having those in the deck. And again, at the very worst, 0 cost, blue, block 3 that fuses, which is all relevant text for different game pieces that are in your deck otherwise, so it makes the cut as the blue as well. And as I say, yellow Aether Ice Veins here. We want the extra damage, extra cards to play off Storm Striders to make those particularly deadly in the final turns of the game, because that's what we want in the more grindy matchups. We want more damage effects that can play well with Storm Striders, so we can block more aggressively early and still have some left over if we happen to draw them in our early hands. And that's kind of where we want to be against Bravo. Briar. Briar, a matchup I'm fairly familiar with at this point, and I really do enjoy playing. The cards you're expecting to be in your deck box for this one might surprise you just a little bit. But for the most part, some of these omissions are for space reasons more than anything else, and also to keep that blue count nice and high. So the ones that aren't particularly shocking, Yellow Ice Vein, Energy Potion, Freezing Point. E-Pots don't block, no need for the extra resources in this matchup. In the sideboard they go. Freezing Point, this matchup's not grindy, not playing that one either. Yellow Aether Ice Veins in this spot. So we don't often get the chance to strip too much extra cards from Briar profitably. They play 3 card hands quite well, so this kind of has to be paired with Insidious Chill. That being said, this and Sink Below, I think are cards you could definitely play in this matchup if you had space, but I think the cards we are playing in this matchup are enough better than these effects against Briar that I have to accept I'm not playing them, because I would rather play those cards. So definitely something I've been umming and ahhing about as to whether I cut Amulet of Ice, play Sink Below, move Amulet of Ice out of the way, play the Ice Veins. But this is where I've settled for now after my games against Briar. I don't think these cards are high. They're not bad. They're definitely not bad, so don't take it that way. They have upsides in the matchup, but they are not the higher value cards to make sure are in your deck. And the same kind of applies to Ice Eternal here in a way, because this card isn't bad, but in this matchup it's very much just a blue block 3 nearly always. And while that's not bad, I don't have space for it, which is why you find it in the sideboard here as well. As we mentioned earlier on, Metacarpus Node is being worn in this matchup, which makes perfect sense. This is one of the matchups where all 3 copies of this Rounds on Me come in. Briar goes wide and could often go tall with relevant breakpoints. So this Rounds on Me can turn all those 4 power cards into 3 power cards, which makes it a heck of a lot easier to block. And at the very worst, it turns the 7 power cards on buffed Nimblisms or Channel Mount Heroics into 6 power cards, which means I can effectively block on-hit triggers like Snatch in spots where I really have to, without giving up a whole extra card to do so, which is very, very important in a matchup like this. It is great in the racing scenarios where you care about being able to do Waning Moon damage, because they don't really want to block you or block your arcane damage and give up cards on their own turn anyway, which is great for that. So fantastic to have extra copies of that effect. Definitely worth playing in this matchup. Hypothermia. Kind of goes without saying in this matchup, I think, for the most part. Briar very reliant on their Snapdragon Scalers and their Embodiment of Lightnings to push extra attacks on a lot of very important turns. Hypothermia just shuts that down, stops things getting go again granted to them, makes the turn less wide, often stops the Rosetta Thorn swing on the end, blocks a lot of damage as a result. Definitely a card you want in this matchup. For the rest of it, up top here, it's the rest of the anti-aggro cards, the Brain Freezes, and the Blizzards, and you can see why these end up being more important for the most part than the cards that are left in the sideboard. Brain Freeze just taking away any of the many zero-cost cards that Briar plays, from Sonata Arcanix to Scar for a Scar to Swarming Gloomveil to anything you like, really. All the zero-cost stuff that's cheap and efficient to make Embodiment of Lightnings. Ripping that out of their hand, taking a whole card away, sometimes fusing to trigger Insidious Chill, and at the very worst being a blue block 3. Powerful combination, definitely want it. And again, we want to stop that Rosetta Thorn at the end of the combat chain very, very often by giving our opponent a Frostbite in a spot where it's very detrimental. Blizzard does just that by sticking itself onto the big attack that came in first, charging them extra resources to be able to attack. Makes it a very, very strong card in this matchup. So, had to make sure we had the room for Blizzard, Brain Freeze, Hypothermia, and this Rounds on Me in this matchup, which of course is 12 cards for our 48 core, which means we just don't have space for everything else in this particular matchup. Cool. Dash. Dash is an interesting one. I'm currently making the assumption when I play against Dash that I'm playing against Jacob Barr's Fatigue Dash. It's the list I've seen significantly more of than traditional Boost Dash. So that's kind of the assumption we're under when we're sideboarding. As a result, the 2-off we pick here is the Yellow Aether Ice Vein. Energy Potion, no good to us there. We really don't want to have any extra resources for any reason. We're looking to tax them in spots to stop them pushing damage, and to try and be the aggressor and squeeze through arcane damage ourselves, because if the game goes long, it's bad for us. The more items they set up, the worse it gets. So we want to be more aggressive. That means we want the extra arcane effects, which is why you see the Yellow Aether Ice Veins and the Freezing Point in the deck in this matchup. That being said, Blizzard, very strong in this matchup as a card, much like Hypothermia, which is also down here in the deck in this matchup. You want to turn off those big turns where they try and have multiple items set up and then try and shoot you like 3 times for 5 or 3 times for 4. And Blizzard, Hypothermia, Channel Lake Frigid are the ways you're going to do that. You'll often find yourself pitch stacking them so that you can draw them again later when all the items are set up. Because stopping, 6 damage when they attack 3 times with no purifiers is fine, but stopping 15 damage when they have 3 purifiers and attacking 3 times, that's much better. So if you can save it for later down the line, you usually will. Not always. Sometimes it's just too efficient to let go. But Blizzard, Channel Lake Frigid, Hypothermia, all cards very much based around trying to shut off the pistol shooting you as many times as it possibly can over the course of the game. Ice Eternal makes the cut here, again, sometimes giving your opponent chunks of frostbites when they intend on charging all their stuff, charging up all their purifiers, charging up all their stuff and things. Super relevant, but I've also found that every now and then you will go for a Frost Hex kill against Fatigue Dash or Control Dash, the Jacob Bar version, because while they're setting up items, they could often be trying to burn you out. You've been very aggressive, you have time to set up Frost Hexes because you're under no pressure. And that does come up. It's not super common, but definitely a line you should be keeping your eyes open for, so you want to make sure Ice Eternal is in the deck, so that you can do it if the ability comes up, otherwise you will not have the chance. The cards that get left over in this matchup, Brain Freezes, truth be told, just don't have space for this. It's actually not terrible in the matchup. They play quite a lot of zeros, which you can steal away, but most of the zeros you steal away aren't particularly relevant, because they're just charging their pistol and their equipment anyway, so you're just denying them resources. They're okay with that. They'll just wait, arsenal card, draw up and try and charge them again next turn. It tends to just not be impactful enough, even though there are like a reasonable number of targets. As previously mentioned, Energy Potion, no need for this in this matchup, don't need the resources, doesn't change anything significant. Sink Below, again, this is kind of where the assumption that I'm not playing against Boost Dash comes in. The Jacob Bar, Fatigue Dash, doesn't attack very much, and until the late game, when those pistol shots are finally worth 4, finally worth 5, you don't want to be spending a Sink Below on a gunshot. It's a really bad trade on card equality. Like stopping 2 damage with a block 4 is a waste, which makes it just a bit of a liability. You never want to draw it early in those matchups, and it's like only okay late, and that's not good enough for a red in Iyslander, so it does not make the cut against Dash. And this round's on me, same thing, just not expecting a lot of attacks in this matchup, so the dex is not relevant, and we have no space to play the 1-of to get to 7 for the magic number, because there's just other cards we'd rather play, so no copies of this round's on me in this matchup. Dori, a matchup I've been seeing plenty of. I think this matchup's actually quite good for you, because you have a number of cards that make it very difficult for your opponent to swing the blade twice. Blizzard, obviously one of the big ones. Hypothermia, one of the big ones. Stops Dawnblade from coming in a second time more often than not, which make them very, very powerful at shutting down Dori's big turns. Brain Freeze, bit of a corner case one, honestly, in this deck. It's mostly a blue block 3 in this matchup that can fuse, and fusing is definitely relevant because Insidious Chill is super, super powerful in the Dori matchup. The key is often going to be stripping cards from them reactively, more so than proactively, because obviously you're going to be blocking quite a lot in order to keep your life total high, try and get counters off of Dawnblade. So being able to keep a card that you can arsenal after blocking with 3 cards, that you can then fuse to trigger your Insidious Chills, makes it more valuable than perhaps like a Yellow Aether Ice Vein, which would require us to keep 3 cards and like basically not block the Dawnblade that turn. You tend to find a lot of Doris who are experienced in the matchup, they try and go tall as opposed to going wide, because they expect a lot of these cards to stop them getting their second swing in. That doesn't mean that you don't play these cards, because stopping the second swing is still stupid good. You should just be expecting your Dori opponent to know that they have to go tall and play accordingly. So you naturally deny that the counter is going on the blade by stopping the second attack, and you should block aggressively or look to, expect to take a chunk of damage from, Iron Song responses and stuff being dumped on a blade that doesn't have go again. That will happen quite a lot in this matchup. So having block 3 is pretty relevant for soaking up that kind of damage. And because those attack reactions end up being the things that are relevant, sometimes Glint the Quicksilver as well in random spots. Sadly, not one you can take. You can only take actions from Dori. But it would be nice if we could snipe attack reactions now. But you're also finding that some of these Dori lists are playing like Scar for a Scar right now. Life for a Life even. Some of these 0 for 4 attacks are quite popular in Dori right now as an alternative way of pressuring opponents. And Brain Freeze does take care of those in a pinch too. So it gets the nod in the blue slot as a way to fuse in your opponent's turn. Trigger Insidious Chills in spots where you have to. Blocks 3 at worst, pitches for 3, and can have some occasional upside against Life for a Life, Scar for a Scar, that kind of thing. Which makes a fair amount of sense, I think. As mentioned already, Hypothermia definitely making the cut in this matchup. Sink Below, unsurprisingly, also making the cut in this matchup because, hey, it's Dori. Defense reactions are good. They've been good since Welcome to Wraith. You like having defense reactions against Dorinthria, for sure. The cards you don't end up playing in this matchup due to exactly that. No Ice Veins. Again, hard to keep 3 cards here and be proactive. You're definitely the defender in this matchup, so Racing with extra Arcane not required. So no Ice Veins, no Freezing Point. E-Pots don't block, and you have no reason to have those extra resources knocking around, so no E-Pots in this matchup. Ice Eternal, just one of the worst blue block 3s. You will never really play this in this matchup. You don't have enough cards to do it in a lot of spots. Means it's often worse than Brain Freeze. If you're not a fan of Brain Freeze in the matchup, you could definitely make the switch, though, if you prefer to have Ice Eternal in your deck for whatever reason. And last but not least, this round's on me, because making Dawnblade smaller is largely irrelevant. And I actually really don't want to give Dori extra cards. It tends to be pretty detrimental to give Dori extra cards, so I'm not interested in this one in this matchup, to be completely honest. Okie dokie, on to Dromai. So kind of as we explained earlier on, Dromai is very much a matchup about just dumping damage into their face as quickly as you can. For the most part, you will ignore dragons that aren't Thermai right up until the point where they're going to kill you, because all of your damage just has to go at the face. Because the longer the game goes, the more dragons they get, the harder it is to kill them all, the more arcane barrier they have. It's just all a bit of a shit show. So you really need to get damage in quickly. As a result, yellow Ice Veins, red Freezing Point in the deck. Sadly, Freezing Point is a bit crap because it can't kill a dragon, which is always rubbish in spots where you really wish it could kill Thermai or something bigger sometimes. But because it is our red of choice in the board for the Oldhim matchup, we're not going to not play a red source of arcane damage in this matchup because we just want as many as we can get our hands on. It's good enough, even though we really do kind of wish it was just like an Ice Bolt a lot of the time in that matchup. Blizzard makes the cut, unsurprisingly, because when you are getting to those final stages of the game where you've been taking tons of dragon hits so you can push damage, you need to start shutting those turns off so that you don't accidentally die while you find a Stormstrider's kill. Blizzard is going to let you do that by taxing the opponent's hand and stopping them from coming in with so many dragons. Obviously, Dromai's hand's often very red heavy, which makes paying for a Blizzard quite difficult in spots where they really want to. Hypothermia, same kind of deal, truth be told. Great at shutting down a turn in a pinch to stop all those Aether Ashwings and big dragons and stuff coming at you. So when it finally gets to that point where you're popping from Arsenal, you're trying to time walk them with Hypothermia, it's going to be very, very good at doing exactly that. And then, of course, we have this round's on me in this matchup, which happens to make all those Ashwings irrelevant. You don't have to worry about taking any damage because they will be attacking for 0. It will make dragons smaller, which is relevant when you're being raced as well. There's less attacks in Dromai these days. This is a bit worse into the lists that are playing Doombreaker Centipies and big Phantasm attacks. That's definitely a little worse. But for the most part, this turns off an awful lot of attacks on big dragon turns and does the Polar Bass thing that we keep talking about in this matchup. Just like it does in every single other one, so happy to play 3 copies in this matchup. As mentioned before, Metacarpus Node makes the cut against Dromai. The cards you're looking to have left in your sideboard, Sink Below, for sure. Do not play defensive cards into Dromai. You are 100% the aggressor. You have to be if you want to win the game. Do not play Sink Below in your deck. Ice Eternal, one that I actually kind of wouldn't mind having in the deck somewhere in the matchup because it is just more damage. It's not good damage, but it is damage, and that's annoyingly kind of what matters in a number of spots. Maybe there's a chance I switch this heading into Worlds if I'm feeling particularly heads up about myself. But I don't think there's any blues here that are worse in my deck than the copies of Ice Eternal, so I just don't think there's space, and it is easily the worst damage in the form of a blue that you have. Energy Potion doesn't push your plan of getting the opponent dead. Energy Potion very much a long game card, and therefore not of any real use to you. And Brain Freeze here, opponent's not an aggro deck, and although we do play it in some matchups where that isn't the case, there's not a lot of great targets here. Cards like Chromai are already a problem, and them being a turn later doesn't stop them from being a problem. And taking a card out of Dromai's hand very rarely stops their turn, and fusing is not really a thing we get up to very often in this matchup. In general, it's just not Insidious Chills aren't really what the matchup is about for the most part, so we don't need the cheap way of triggering those either, which is why Brain Freeze does not make the cut. We just have enough blues that we already want to play in this matchup, like Blizzard, Hypothermia, and this round's on me, that all have relevant game text, and we want all of the damage in our deck in this matchup, so for sure. Now, Fi is a really contentious matchup, and I'm going to say this by saying I've been debating my sideboard plan in this matchup more than any other. It's been really hard to find a plan that consistently beats Fi. It's easily the matchup I'm most worried about, but this is where I am, and this is where I intend to board against Fi currently. So the cards you expect to not have in your deck in this matchup: Amulet of Ice, Epot. These have to go. You do not want cards that block 0. The only ones that are acceptable are Blizzard for obvious reasons, and Heart of Fiendel does stay in the deck because the life gain is annoyingly super relevant over the course of a game against Fi. Every point really does count, and that makes it good enough, even if it doesn't block, in my opinion. Yellow Aether Ice Vein. We don't get time to keep 3-card hands very often against Fi anymore. A lot of the hands that you take damage to keep have to be red attack hands to be able to play a Fighting Spirit back, or a Wounded Ball back, or a Scar for a Scar into a Coronet Peak. You have to keep cards in, or even like Red Aether Ice Vein. The red one definitely more valuable, but there are already enough things you want to keep 3-card, 2-card hands against Fi. A matchup where typically you need to be blocking a lot to soak up damage, not have mass triggers, not let them have Mask of the Pouncing Lynx if they're doing that, which they should be. You should be expecting Mask of the Pouncing Lynx for the most part. But you're going to be blocking a lot, and the sad truth is you're also going to be activating Waning Moon a lot. This matchup comes down to trying to keep life totals even a lot of the time. You need to be playing those cards out of your arsenal that replace themselves, so you've got another card to block with, and then can activate Waning Moon too, because Fi does not want to give you cards to pay for Arcane Barrier. He will take the Arcane to keep putting damage in your skull, and you should be expecting that to be the case. So activate Waning Moon as often and aggressively as you possibly can in this matchup, because it's really your best tool. You need to keep chipping them down, because if all you're doing is blocking and you're never establishing game pieces, never pushing damage while you do it, they're going to be on 37 when you turn the corner. And you can't deal 37 before they deal 8. It just doesn't happen. So you have to push damage while you are blocking. It's a thing that's super, super important in this matchup. The Freezing Point, unsurprisingly, not a grindy matchup. Don't want it. Don't need the extra Arcane here either. Single copy of Hypothermia doesn't make the cut. Now, this is strange. You'd think maybe I want to play this over the Heart of Fiendel, have an extra card that blocks, is good in the matchup in the face of like Searing Emberblade, even like Lava Vein Loyalty. Truth be told, I actually don't think Hypothermia is very good in the matchup. It's fine. It's the reason we play 2. I think you want to be able to play some. But in multiples, it's a bit of a liability. It blocking 2 is not great in general. And you find that a lot of experienced Fire players will often leave the Emberblade until very late in the turn, because they know Hypothermia exists. They know it's a card they have to respect. And so they'll try and weave it in at like attack 4, maybe. Sometimes even attack 5 if they've got resources spare. Or actively will spend more cards and not pitch to the Emberblade in some spots to make sure their turn doesn't get stopped by Hypothermia. And that makes the card a bit of a liability in spots, because good Fi players know that Hypothermia exists. So I think you want some. Sometimes pitching them is more valuable than playing them, because your opponent knows they have to respect it. I do not think you want the 3rd. I think the life gain from Heart of Fiendel is worth more. And Ice Eternal in this matchup is just never getting played, in my opinion, apart from exactly turn 0. Otherwise, it's a blue block 3. You don't need it in the deck. The ones that do make the cut, of course, this round's on me very much for this matchup. It's one of the reasons the card is in the deck, full stop. Make those wide turns smaller. Great on turn 0. Lets me activate Waning Moon alongside it. And often, if I'm this round on meing early against Fi, like on the first attack of the turn, I am preventing more damage than will be dealt by the extra card I give them, especially if I'm willing to block with the card I draw from this round's on me. It's just fantastic in this matchup. It's one of the big reasons it's in the deck. Sink below, the 4 power cards in Fi are some of the most important ones. Mounting Anger, Snatch, even like Blaze Headlong to an extent, but Soaring Strike, that's another one. They are very impactful on hit triggers that you have to respect. Being able to answer them cleanly for a single card is very strong. Obviously, you do not want to sink below a Phoenix Flame or a Weapon Swing. It's a bit of a waste. But you will happily sink below at the end of a combat chain. So a lot of people are worried about like blocking with sink below to make sure they get their value, if that makes sense. Like, don't get stuck with the card in hand. Don't do that. You can expect a lot of Fi's big turns to finish on a Assault the Wound or a Lava Burst, one of these really big chain ender attacks. Take the tempo, something like this. you'd much rather have the Sink Below in your hand to be able to soak up damage from those relevant attacks to end the combat chain. Because at the very worst, if they don't come, you just Arsenal the Sink Below. Just stick it in your arsenal. It's fine. That's really not a problem. You can always block with the blue. You were going to Arsenal on the final card if you know it's the final card, and save the Sink Below for more value. It's okay to do that, so don't be too scared to do so. 2 Hypothermias, kind of talked about why we play this card already. I do think you want some, just not all 3, which is perfectly fine in my opinion. The last copies of cards that make the cut in this matchup, Brain Freeze, Blizzard, we kind of talked about why these are in the deck in the first place, and all of those things apply to this matchup. Shut down your opponent's turns where you can with Blizzard, with cards from the arsenal, and Brain Freeze really shines in this matchup. Triggers Insidious Chill very cheaply, which I do think is relevant in this matchup. If you can establish chills, taking cards away from Fi, especially alongside Coronet Peak, is very strong. And of course, you can screw them over with Phoenix Flames and stuff and things like this. You can score 0-cost cards in very important spots where you can shut Fi's turn down if you do it. One of the more disgusting things you can definitely do, they'll play Art of War, you can Brain Freeze in response, and sometimes you can take away their only attack action, which kills the turn dead. Which is obviously absolutely hilarious if you're able to do it. So it comes up every now and then as well. But the card, at worst, blue block 3, which is more than fine. And it has upside in the matchup, which is exactly why you play it. So there is your Fi sideboard plan. The mirror match. As I mentioned before, I am trying to be more proactive in the mirror. So I keep my Scar for Scars instead of playing Sink Below, which is where I think I currently am. We want more damage, more effects in this matchup, in my opinion. The cards that you do not see from me, Blizzard Hypothermia, for obvious reasons, they're not relevant game text in this matchup. We have 2 copies of this round on me in the board. Part of me kind of wants to not play any, because giving Iyslander extra cards really can be dangerous. But I've decided that none of the other cards are better. I don't think I want Sink Below, and having that 7th copy of the Polar Blast Cold Snap effect is worth enough. And the Sink Belows, kind of explained already why I don't play these. I'm trying to be the more proactive Iyslander of the pair, than the reactive one I expect a lot of my opponents to be. Armor Suite, AB5, kind of mentioned this when we were looking at the armor in the deck. We have the 1 copy of this round on me that we just mentioned, 7th copy of that effect, and another blue block 3 in the matchup, which makes it more than okay. Ice Eternal, you do want in this matchup. Damage is important, damage is very important, and you will indeed have some Frost Hex kills in this matchup. So having a blue block 3 that fuses cheap, triggers Insidious Chill to rip cards out of your opponent's hand, and can make Frostbites for Ice Eternal. Very, very strong where you want it, essentially. More arcane damage in the deck, which is something that we absolutely want. Freezing Points and Aether Ice Veins in the deck for this matchup. Storm Striders is your biggest threat. You want to be able to threaten it in spots where your opponent needs to respect it. When the game goes long, gets late, Metacarpus Node's still available. You want to make sure that your opponent that's on 7 can't just crack their own Striders and dump 14 into you, or you know, play all their cards and pitch to Waning Moon to really put you under pressure. You want to make sure you have enough arcane attacks in your deck to be able to threaten a Storm Strider's kill consistently. Red Ice Veins alone just don't do that. Energy Potions are fantastic in this matchup. They are on-board AB, so that you don't have to give up cards to do it in a lot of spots. They let you break through Frostbites if your opponent has a Frost Hex in play. They give you, a cheeky Waning Moon activation on a turn where you really need it. To push damage in a spot where that matters, for example. In the pinch next to your Tunic, they can just pay for a Wounded Bull or a Fighting Spirit all by themselves. They're very good in this matchup. You should definitely be playing them. Brain Freeze here, very much a blue block 3 for the most part. Does turn on Waning Moon, which is why it gets a nudge over something like Blizzard. Blocking 3 actually somewhat relevant in this matchup now, apparently. And every now and then you will take away something with Brain Freeze too. Doesn't happen too often. But there are times where you want to fuse it to strip cards away with Insidious Chill so that your opponent has less cards to play to pay for Arcane Barrier with. It does come up. And in those cases, sometimes you will find yourself stealing an Epot or stealing an Amulet of Ice, or even just like a Frosting or whatever. Like, these aren't super impactful hits, but when you take away 3 pitch, sometimes you can make your opponent take extra damage off a Waning Moon, or just deny them an Arsenal too, which can obviously be super relevant if you need to take them off of an Arsenal. Definitely comes up. Last but not least, 2 yellow Aether Ice Veins, because we want more arcane damage like we explained with the Freezing Point. So that is where we are in the mirror, keeping the Scar for Scars instead of the Sink Belows, trying to be the more proactive one. Kano, unsurprisingly, pretty similar to Iyslander, truth be told. A lot of the same thought processes going into the matchup. The things you don't see in this matchup, Blizzard, the Freezing Point doesn't make the cut in this case for me. I wanted the extra blue, which is why I played the extra copy of this round on me. And I also think trying to pop a Freezing Point off of a Storm Striders in this matchup just gives Kano a huge window to kill you. It's too expensive. and therefore usually not worth being a red in your deck, because it being a red definitely can be a detriment. Hypothermia, not relevant game text. Sink below, not relevant game text. Equipment here, all arcane barrier, all the time. This round's on me. You will basically never play this in this matchup, to be honest. Giving Kano extra cards is beyond dangerous. It is mostly a blue. You want your blue count as high as possible in this matchup because that is what matters against Kano, in my opinion. Ice Eternal, same thing for the most part. Not going to play this one. Sometimes you will end up scoring some Frostbites to shut Kano off of playing a Tome that he banished or something stupid. But these are, for the most part, you know, 0-cost cards that confuse to Insidious Chill in a pinch. Or also just blues. Just blues, because those are really what matters against Kano the most. You play as many blues as you possibly can, truth be told. Energy Potions here, same kind of prospect really as Iyslander. Onboard AB is incredible in this matchup. It's a blue by itself. It's very, very good against Wizard. You should definitely be playing it in those regards, because it does all the things you want it to do. Blue Brain Freeze is very much kind of the same thought process as Iyslander once again, if we're being honest. Mostly a blue. But you can snipe cards away from Kano sometimes as well in relevant spots. And putting cards on top of Kano's deck can be really funny. If they, you know, Ragamuffin Tat and like put the card they want to banish back on top of their deck from the Ragamuffin Tat, keep the blue in their hand, and you're just like, oh, Brain Freeze. And the blue in their hand is a 0-cost card. That's really bad for them. And it definitely, by all itself, makes Brain Freeze like worth playing. Again, at the worst, a blue, which is all that matters in this matchup, but it has relevant game text sometimes, which is more than enough. And then we do play the yellow Aether Ice Veins. The reason for this mostly because I wanted a little bit of extra damage. It being a yellow makes it less of a liability than something like Freezing Point. It does pitch to Waning in the pinch as well. And 4 is fine, honestly. 4 damage is fine. Taking a card away from Kano, definitely worth something as well if you're happy to play this off of 2 cards. This is a bit better than Freezing Point 2 in the sense of like... it's like Freezing Point is 3 for 5 is a bad rate when you're not fusing it. You really want to be fusing Freezing Point to do like 8 damage. And these are better off of like 2 card hands where you do not want to fuse, essentially. Or you want to keep that extra card hidden or secret for whatever reason. But most of the time, it's the fuse that matters because it can take away a card from Kano, which is why I think you want to play the other 2 and have access to that extra damage effect off of Stormstriders in this matchup. So that's where we are against Kano. Not a matchup I've tested extensively, unsurprisingly, but that is where we are. Katsu. Katsu, very much like Fi, honestly. Ninja. There's plenty of cards in the deck that are good against Ninja. No Ice Eternals in this matchup. Again, not really relevant game text. Probably the worst of your blues overall. No need for the extra Arcane. We are definitely the more controlling hero in this matchup, so we do not need to be pressuring our opponent. Energy Potions do not block, which is super important against Katsu. We have no reason for those extra resources. And Sink Below is like fine against Katsu, honestly. It's stopping relevant hits from their combo lines. But for the most part, they match up very poorly against the smaller attacks that Katsu tends to play. They're very bad into Kodachis, and we have plenty of cards in this matchup that we want to play over it, which is why it does not make the cut. This round's on me, unsurprisingly, really good against Katsu. Stops all those go wide attacks that are very small, including those Kodachis from doing any relevant hits, and just kind of turns off Mask all by itself while doing a good Polar Blast impression and blocking 3, which makes it very, very, very strong in this matchup. Hypothermia. Harmonized Kodachis do not like Hypothermia. It's really good against those, somewhat unsurprisingly. What else have we got in this matchup? We've got Brain Freeze and Blizzard, which, again, just 2 very, very strong cards against these aggressive decks. Blizzard can often shut down Katsu's entire turn, because he likes to lead on his Kodachis and spend his resources there. And Brain Freeze, well, unsurprisingly, Katsu playing a pile of 0-cost cards to enable those Kodachis, which means Brain Freeze has plenty of targets, making a cheap blue block 3 that can fuse for relevant game text, as we kind of keep saying in these spots, which makes it the blue of choice in this matchup. Levia, a matchup that I really haven't played very much. I've not had much time to test into Levia heading into Worlds. So most of this one is theory, much like the Rhinar. No Blizzards here, no Hypothermias here. It's a bit controversial. I'm not entirely sure it's correct, because you can turn off those Blood Rush Bellow turns, but for the most part, Brutes don't go wide, or like super wide on non-Blood Rush Bellow turns. Blizzard can be a liability because it doesn't block, which means that if you get intimidated and it's the card that gets stuck in your hand, that's real bad news. And Hypothermia doesn't do anything outside of those Blood Rush Bellow turns. There's a chance I should have them in the deck, I'm not sure, but I do think I'd rather have more block 3s and cards that are going to be better when I'm getting intimidated by like barraging beatdowns, or just need to block like swing bigs and stuff. So that's kind of where I am. Freezing Point, not a grindy matchup. We don't want access to that one. E-Pots, no need for the extra resources. They don't block. 2 Brain Freezes are left in the board here. We are playing 1 to up the blue count ever so slightly. I think it's just the worst, like the best worst card, unfortunately, for this matchup. There's a good chance maybe it should be a Hypothermia instead of the Brain Freeze, because quite frankly, outside of Barraging Beatdown, I don't see too many things that you're going to be ever sniping with Brain Freeze. There's a good chance it should be a Hypothermia, and maybe that's a switch I make before we play at Worlds. I'm not entirely sure. This round's on me, mostly a blue block 3 in this matchup, but it's actually kind of hard for Levia to use extra cards sometimes. Hilariously, you can really screw them over if they try and set up like a Blood Rush Bellow or a card that needs to discard a 6, and you make them draw an extra card, because sometimes they will draw a card that is not a 6, and they will then discard it, and the turn just kind of ends. Doesn't happen very often, you shouldn't be relying on that, but damn is it funny when it happens. Sink Below really solid into Brute in my opinion. Strong in general against both Levia and Rhinar if you're getting intimidated, because you want your cards to block as best you can, and they're not embarrassing to have in your arsenal if you're trying to prevent yourself from getting intimidated. So I like Sink Below quite a lot. It can help you fix hands in spots where Intimidate kind of screws you. And of course there's plenty of big attacks against, plenty of 7s and 8s and 9s in Brute, and having defense reactions in the face of those is, in my opinion, pretty strong. Ice Eternal, not a card you play too much in this matchup, but it is a blue block 3 that offers you some more damage, and damage can be quite important in the Brute matchup coming out of the arsenal. So definitely happy to have these, but they're not super important. They are just kind of like the best of the blues, in my opinion, which is why they make the cut. We then have the single Brain Freeze I talked about a moment ago. Again, good chance maybe this should just be a Hypothermia. Maybe there's a good chance these Amulet of Ices should be the rest of the Hypothermias, but I've not tested this matchup extensively, so I'm not entirely sure. And the 2 Yellow Aether Ice Veins, in my opinion, the best thing you can be doing, honestly, is stripping cards out of Brute's hand, because they need a lot of cards to operate, especially Rhinar, but also Levia, when you're trying to do these things like playing multiple cards before your big attack, needing to keep cards to discard to pay for costs. So stripping cards out very, very strong. Makes me like the Yellow Ice Veins quite a lot against them to earn cards. And it's why I choose to play the Amulet of Ices too, I think, over Hypothermia, because they can strip cards away proactively, which I think I want to do. But again, haven't tested this matchup enough to be 100% sure on that card choice. Lexi, a matchup I've not seen a ton of either at the moment. Feels like it's just probably pretty bad into Oldhim, and it's kind of leaving itself unchecked. So you'll see some wonky numbers as a result. We're not really boarding to respect Lexi. We're very much trying to keep our blue count where we want it, and play cards in our deck that happen to be good in the matchup. So in this case, no freezing point once again. Same reasons as we've explained before. Not a grindy matchup. Not looking for the extra damage off of Storm Striders from freezing point plus Ice Bolt effect. So no need for this. Energy Potions, again, no need for the extra resources. Don't need to be in the deck. Sink Below. Sink Below, a card I definitely thought about playing into Lexi, and if I see that they are like more go tall Lexi, or I have reason to believe that's the case, maybe I will. But for the most part, I think I want more of a blue count in this matchup so I can block with cards that don't function. And most of my block 3s should block just fine into Lexi. I think there's very few relevant hit triggers outside of Endless Arrow that I need to particularly care about. And those can just be for 5 if Voltaire wants them to be, which means Sink Below doesn't block it strategically anyway. And this round's on me. I think there's a good chance maybe this card should be in the deck somewhere in this matchup, but I don't think Lexi ever goes wide enough for it to really reduce the impact of letting them draw a card. Lexi's quite a resource-hungry deck, and giving them an extra card can feel like it should be pretty detrimental, especially if it lets them fuse. So it's kind of the blue that finds itself by the wayside. You'll notice that we're playing a single copy of Ice Eternal in the deck. I think it's just slightly better than this round's on me in this matchup. The game text is likely to matter ever so slightly more. But there's a good chance we could just follow our 7th copy of Polar Blast mentality in this matchup and have a single copy of this round's on me instead. I just think it's very unlikely I'm going to play the card in the matchup, because I think giving Lexi an extra card could be very, very dangerous. So I would rather have the single copy of Ice Eternal instead, in my opinion, even though the game text on that card not particularly likely to come up either. The cards that do make the cut in this matchup, Hypothermia, pretty good at taking Go Again away off of an arrow, because it's usually granted by Voltaire for the most part. So you can stop the second arrow coming, which means Hypothermia often blocks for like 5 in the course of a turn, because it stops that second attack, which is, in my opinion, really quite strong. We then have Brain Freeze Blizzard, very much the same process, assuming our Voltaire opponents are quite aggressive in general. Blizzard can help us turn off that second arrow, stop it coming in our direction, because again, Lexi quite resource hungry, doesn't often have many resources to spare, making paying an extra 3 quite difficult to send that extra arrow. And Brain Freeze, I feel like there are enough zero cost arrows, and Lexi draws like enough arrow light hands that I can definitely catch some arrows in spots that matter, and for the most part it is a blue block 3. I think Yellow A for Ice Vein definitely shines in this matchup for sure, in my opinion as well. Because again, Lexi, very resource hungry, so stripping cards out of their hand, very strong. I want as many of my attacks as possible to be doing exactly that. Okie dokie. Oldhim. Oldhim, obviously one of the big matchups we're expecting. I am choosing to respect Fi a little bit more than Oldhim heading into Worlds, and you'll see that in my sideboard choices and kind of in the fact we're playing Scar for a Scar, much like we talked about before, instead of playing Fate for Scene. But we can live with that. So, one of the more interesting ones for me at the moment, I'm not playing Amulet of Ice into Oldhim. I keep finding myself in spots where this card is a huge liability now that we do not set up combo kills very often. It not blocking was super painful. You don't play your Aether Ice Veins as often as you would like in this matchup because of the amount of pressure you're under on big attack turns. And finding room for like Amulet of Ice just never really came through for me. In playtesting, I kept finding myself being very upset that I'd drawn it instead of any other blue that blocked or any other ice card. I stopped playing it in the matchup and I've not missed it, and that's mostly the rationale I can give you for it not being in the deck, to be honest. I don't think you get much time to set up these big combo kills most of the time anymore, and that makes Amulet of Ice alongside all these other 2 blocks, all these energy potions, all these other cards that block very poorly into liabilities. And I think you do have to block well against Oldhim. I think it's a very important factor of the matchup to make sure you aren't leaking too much damage over the course of the game. No need for Blizzard, no need for Brain Freeze, no need for Hypothermia. These are all anti-aggro cards, of which Oldhim is not, even though his attacks are aggressive in nature. They are single attacks that are quite big, which makes all of these cards pretty redundant all round. We are playing the Crown of Providence, as previously mentioned in the deck breakdown. This round's on me. Not a card you're going to play too often in this matchup. It's not embarrassing to come out of the arsenal because it will let you chip with Waning Moon if you really need to. But for the most part, it's a blue block 3. And as I kind of mentioned a moment ago, blues are important, blocking 3 is important. That makes it make the cut in this matchup. Very much the same for Ice Eternal. This one obviously slightly better than this round's on me in the matchup because you will still have Frost Hex games on occasion, and you need this card in your deck to be able to make sure that's a win con that you can play to towards the end of the game, especially if you find yourself in a spot where you're pitching these blues aggressively quite early to pay for red attacks. You're going to have a pitch stack at the bottom of your deck that is all Frost Hexes, Insidious Chills, Ice Eternals, and if you have enough life to play with, you can set up a really quick kill from the bottom of your deck in those spots as well. So definitely make sure it's in your deck. It's just not quite as good as it maybe once was. Again, extra arcane important in this matchup, in my opinion. You need to have it because you're looking to make sure those Stormstriders threaten lethal as often as possible, and your counter attacks into Oldhim need to be strong to match the power of the attacks that are coming at you, especially on Oldhim's like Rouse the Ancients and E-Strike turns. So Freezing Point, kind of talked about comboing it off Striders earlier on. It's mostly the reason it's in the deck is for this matchup, and those 2 copies of Yellow Aether Ice Vein are our extra 3 arcane spells, and then we have our 2 copies of Energy Potion, which admittedly not blocking is more relevant than ever before in this matchup, but this helps you beat Stalagmite, it helps you beat Winter's Wail, and in general helps you push through big Ice Eternals in spots where you need those to be lethal too if you're setting up those combo kills, which means they are still worth playing in my opinion. Rhinar. We kind of talked about this matchup very briefly when we were looking at Levia, and unsurprisingly for those folks who may have watched the Levia one a moment ago, our sideboard process here is almost exactly the same. I am choosing to play Hypothermia into Rhinar instead of this round's on me. There's very little rationale for that, if I'm being completely honest. I think if I'm applying it to like Levia, I should probably be applying it to Rhinar too. It's a very good chance I update these to match in one way or the other prior to Worlds. I do think Hypothermia is slightly more relevant, with Rhinar likely playing cards like Wild Ride. That definitely comes up, so they have slightly more go-again attacks than just their Mandible Claws, their Bloodrush Bellow turns. But I think for the most part the difference is pretty negligible. If I'm choosing to play Hypothermia in one, or this round's on me in one, I should probably be playing it in both, not just one or the other. That being said, the rest of the sideboard plan here, very much the same as the other brutes. Sink Below's defense reaction is very strong against getting intimidated, in my opinion. Choosing to have the Hypothermias here instead Ice Eternal, blue block 3 for the most part, nothing else particularly special in that capacity. The single Brain Freeze to make up the extra blue that happens to block 3, and then those copies of Yellow Aetherized Fane so we can strip cards away from their hand, which is important against Brute because they need multiple cards to operate on those biggest possible turns. So definitely kind of what we're looking for there against Rhinar. And then last but not least, Viserai, a matchup that has kind of fallen out of favour, honestly, over the last handful of weeks. Probably since, PT2, to be completely honest. A matchup I really adore playing. The cards you'll find yourself not playing in this matchup. This round's on me. Giving Viserai extra cards is not something I really want to do. They don't tend to go wide enough to benefit from the trigger. Kind of the same thought process as I had a moment ago, where maybe I could play the one copy of this to have our 7 copies magic number instead of the 1 Ice Eternal. I just think that Ice Eternal game text is likely to be slightly more relevant, but I could definitely see myself making this change before I start playing at Worlds. Certainly not impossible. The 3 copies of Sink Below, they don't really match up very well with any of the attacks you care about. There is definitely an argument for them against like Consuming Volition and things like that. Reek of Corruption if you're expecting those from your opponent's list. But for the most part, the cards we're playing are more impactful in this matchup than Sink Below. Ice Eternal, not something we mostly want. No Frost Text kills in this matchup. We are playing the single copy because freezing your opponent out on a Mordred Tide turn can definitely be very valuable. The extra damage spell comes up in a number of spots because this matchup is very much a tempo race where you're looking to use Alluvian Constellas to pay for your moon to be able to aggressively keep your life totals close so that Storm Striders can provide you with that kill when both of you are down in kill range. So having a blue, the extra blue in this matchup to keep that blue count high, that is also a damage effect that may also cause like Revel in Runeblood to fizzle if you're able to freeze it off of a Storm Striders at a relevant point or something to that effect. Feels like more impactful game text on a blue block 3 than the single copy of This Round's on Me. No need for Freezing Point in this matchup because, again, not looking to set up a Storm Striders kill that does more than 10 damage in that matchup. It's just not great on rate, and we're not looking to have access to that kind of effect. And the 2 E-Pots, again, no need for the extra resources in any particular way in this matchup. I really like my cards to block in this matchup, and most of my blues are more reasonable than this because a lot of them are going to be preventing arcane damage or being pitched for big attacks anyway, in my opinion. As previously mentioned, Alluvian Constellas does make the cut in this matchup. We're more than happy to wear this on the chest. You'll notice that my tunic is currently in the main board, even though it definitely should not be. It should be listed as a sideboard card. It's just a bit of a misclick on my part. You want Alluvian Constellas in this matchup. I'll go fix that after I finish the recording. In terms of cards, in this case that you're bringing in, again, that single copy of Ice Eternal we've already kind of talked about. Hypothermia, very, very strong at turning off those Mavri and Skies turns. Keep in mind this thing can be shortcutted with Spellbound Creepers. Your opponent can play around it if they want to, but it is mostly strong enough at turning off Mavri and Skies turns and other incidental go again turns that it is worth playing 3 of in the deck. It's going to block enough damage most of the time, in my honest opinion. Brain Freeze. Brain Freeze is insane against Viserai. It's so much fun to steal their Revels, their Sonatas. They become the Arc Knights. All these super impactful non-attack actions that Viserai kind of thrives on. The Mordred Tides, the Mavrian Skies. There's just so many really big impactful targets in this matchup. And as I said before, you can do the sneaky little trick of stealing away the thing they intended to Spellbound Creepers in. So they lose their Creepers and do not get an action point. And that always feels like you've hit gold when you are able to do it. Blizzard. Blizzard card that I think is also very respectable in this matchup. Again, trying to stop Rosetta Thorn from hitting you on the end of a combat chain can often be very, very powerful because it basically means Blizzard is blocking 4, sometimes 5 or 6 if you catch a Revel in Runeblood in a very awkward spot, because you're able to stop the Revel swing coming in afterwards, and in those times, the Revel will blow up all the rune chants, so it can actually save you a chunk of damage if your opponent is caught out by a Blizzard you have carefully held. So consider making that line of play sometimes if you get the opportunity to. You'd be surprised how often you're able to poke off rune chants by your opponent being a bit greedy. And the 2 Yellow Aetherized Veins do make the cut in this matchup. I do think they're pretty medium, but as I mentioned before, a lot of the matchup is very much about trying to keep life totals somewhat even on the way down, while Alluvian Constellas pays for your moon so that Storm Striders can win you the game on the final turn when both players' life totals are really close. And when that's the case, I do want some extra damage in my deck, and that makes Yellow Aetherized Fane acceptable in my opinion. At the very worst, a block 3 that I can pitch to Waning Moon, which is definitely not something to turn your nose up at either. Okay, that's been about an hour and 40 minutes of talking solid, and unsurprisingly, my throat is dry. I should have brought a drink in with me before I started shooting this video. I'm very proud of this deck. I've put a lot of work into Worlds. I've done a lot of playtesting. I'm struggling pretty bad with the imposter syndrome about the event, to be completely honest. So I've tried really hard to remedy that. I've tested to my best of my ability, and hopefully we have a positive story to tell you about the World Championships when I get back, and we can talk about these videos and this deck in detail, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions, and maybe even share some of the experiences and where I was right and where I was wrong at Worlds when all is said and done. But this is my Iyslander list for Classic Constructed. You're able to find my Briar list on the channel. Maybe not right now if you're watching this straight on release, because the Blitz rounds might not have happened yet, but it is intending to release as the Blitz rounds start. So you should hopefully be able to check it out very, very soon if it's not available on the channel already. And if I can ask you for one final thing, if this guide or this breakdown of Iyslander has been helpful for you, please consider subscribing to the channel. I really want to make more Flesh and Blood content. I really want to be more involved with the community. And just kind of champion a game that I'm very passionate about. And in order to do that, I need to try and grow my following in this space. So if you are enjoying this content, please let me know. Leave a comment below. Let me know what I'm doing well, what I can improve on. And subscribe, turn on those notifications so that you don't miss anything I'm putting out moving forward, to let me know I'm doing a good job. I think that's everything. So wish me luck, folks. I'm playing in the first ever Flesh and Blood World Championships in about 48 hours, and I'm excited and terrified, and that's such a magical way to feel. For now, I've been HowlingMines. You've been amazing, and hopefully by the time I see you next, I am your first Flesh and Blood World Champion.